Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, the Supreme Court shot down D.C.'s gun control law. We ask constitutional law expert Alan Morrison what gun regulations can survive the High Court's Second Amendment ruling. With the growing likelihood of a Democratic president and Congress in 2009, organized labor is making a list. We'll chat with Bill Samuels, AFL-CIO Legislative Director, about labor's priorities. Also, Diesel Billy Bill Kirchen performs his Grammy-nominated tune. Versatile choreographer and dancer Christopher Morgan drops by. We've got poetry by JaHipster and Judith Harris, and the sights and sounds of the 4th of July on the Coffee House.
Welcome to Courting Justice at the Coffee House. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. These are the precise words of the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. Proponents of gun control laws and those who oppose such laws have debated the meaning of these words for many years without much guidance from the United States Supreme Court. Does the Second Amendment provide individuals a constitutional right to bear arms? The court finally addressed this issue for the first time in over 50 years in a very close decision issued on the last day of its term this year. Here to shed light on this landmark decision and its implications is Supreme Court litigator and constitutional scholar Alan Morrison. Welcome, Alan, to the Coffee House.
Thank you. Pleasure being here.
Well, this case, District of Columbia versus Heller, challenged the constitutionality of the District of Columbia's handgun law. And in fact, the court did find that there's a constitutional right for individuals to, in fact, own and possess guns. And I know that you played a key role in writing the brief for the District of Columbia in which it defended its handgun law and argued that, that there should not be a constitutional right to bear arms. So before we talk about the case, tell me a little bit about how this case ended up in the Supreme Court. Who is Mr. Heller anyway, and how did his case end up all the way at the Supreme Court?
Mr. Heller was one of 6 plaintiffs carefully chosen by the lawyers who got this case together. Gun enthusiasts for years have been strategizing and thinking about bringing a case, and they deliberately chose the law in the District of Columbia, which is the strictest law in the country. It forbids any handgun ownership by any person in their homes, for that matter, any place else in the district. But the impact is principally on their homes. And in addition, it also had a trigger lock provision, which made it even more difficult, they argued, to defend yourself. And they carefully chose the district, and they chose it for a variety of reasons. And
well, before we get into that, though, and I do want to talk about why they chose this case, but just technically, this guy Heller, I mean, who was he, and how did he end up being the case they chose?
Well, I don't know how he ended up being there, but they carefully chose people who they thought would be representative of people who had no criminal records and who had legitimate uses for guns. They were afraid. Heller was not necessarily afraid. He was a security guard working for the federal legal system, the court system, and he had a gun at work. And therefore, he obviously was somebody who knew how to use a gun and had been trained in it, and he wanted to have a gun at his home. He owned rifles, which he kept outside the district, but he never tried to bring them into his home in the district. And he applied for a permit to get a handgun. In the district, it is illegal to have a handgun, and therefore, you obviously would be denied a permit. The other 5 plaintiffs never actually went through the process of asking for a permit, and so the Court of Appeals said they didn't have the right to go to court and object, no standing in legalese. And so it was just Dick Heller that got to the Supreme Court.
So he goes, applies for a gun permit, knowing, I guess, that it's going to be denied, and then appeals that decision, gets into the courts, makes its way all the way to the Supreme Court.
That's right.
And you say that this litigation was supported by opponents of gun control
Yes, actually,
laws.
the National Rifle Association had brought another case after this one was brought, and that case did not get very far. It was thrown out of the courts, and there was apparently at one point some dispute between the National Rifle Association and the plaintiffs in this case as to whether to go ahead with this one. But when it got to the Supreme Court, the National Rifle Association fully supported Mr. Heller.
So you think they picked this case because it's the District of Columbia's law and it's the strictest law? You hear that all the time, that DC's law is either the strictest or one of the strictest in the country. Can you tell us a little bit about that law? I mean, what's so different about that law and the gun control laws in most jurisdictions?
Well, the district is one of a few places, Chicago and New York more or less, and perhaps San Francisco, that ban handguns in the home. And the district did this for two reasons. One is that we're a completely urban environment, and gun violence is a much bigger problem here than it is other places. And there are many fewer legitimate uses for any firearms in the district, let alone handguns. And the city council back in 1976, one of the first acts they undertook after they got home rule from the federal government was to pass this gun control law. And they did it for two sets of reasons. One, to try to reduce the violence and crimes from guns, legal or not legal. We, of course, in the district can't prevent guns from coming in to the city unless you set up a roadblock at every single street.
And both Maryland and Virginia have pretty liberal
gun laws, and they have gun shops not very far from the border, and people can bring guns in, legally owned guns or illegally owned guns. And of course, if people own guns in their homes, one of the things that criminals steal is guns so they can commit more crimes. But there was a second set of reasons that was very significant for the city council, and that was the evidence that even lawful citizens, otherwise lawful citizens, having guns in their home causes problems. Accidents, children, grown-ups. Second, suicides. Very strong evidence that suicides increase. Some studies done after the district's law was passed showing marked decrease in suicides overall, not just from guns, in the district. Whereas in neighboring counties in Virginia and Maryland, where there was no gun ban, the suicide rate stayed the same. And third, for unfortunate reasons, domestic violence breeds a lot of guns. People get angry, people come home drunk, they pick up guns, and they start using them. And the district said, for all those reasons, we don't want handguns in your home. You can have a rifle, you can have a shotgun, but you can't have a handgun.
Well, opponents of the law will argue, well, the district is, has had, at least in the past, and may still have one of the highest homicide rates in the country. So they would argue the law's not working. What would you say to that?
Well, I'd say two things. First, the homicide rate has gone up and down while the law has remained unchanged. So it's hard to pin it to the gun law. The second is, of course, there are many reasons for homicide rates. Scientists among our audience would know the term controlled experiment, holding everything else constant. Well, you can't do that ethically with gun laws. People would die. And so we have to take our best judgment, and usually we trust our legislators to do that, to make this judgment. But as Justice Scalia put it, the Second Amendment takes certain judgments off the table.
Well, I want to talk about what Justice Scalia said, and just let's look at the language of the Second Amendment, all right? It starts out, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So it starts out talking about a militia. The language about the right to bear and keep arms seems to be sort of, this is the way we implement the militia. But clearly the Supreme Court didn't read it that way.
Well, certainly 5 members of the court didn't read it that way, and 4, led by Justice Stevens, read it the way you have suggested it be read. The court did it by doing several things. First, it said, well, the introductory phrase is an explanatory phrase, and we'll see what that means after we get to the main operative phrase. No reason in my judgment to do that, but they did it. And so starting off by skipping the well-regulated militia and ending up by saying, well, that was one of the purposes, but we find other purposes, although if you look at the language of the amendment, none of the other purposes are there.
Right, and I thought Justice Scalia was the strict constructionist who believes in the literal words of the Constitution.
Well, he believes in an original meaning, and what he said was, and I don't accept it, is that if you go back to the English history, before the founding of the United States, England had laws that forbade the use of guns, and those were changed. The difficulty with those laws is one set of laws allowed Catholics to have guns and said Protestants couldn't have them. We would deal with that through our religion clauses.
Protestants more violent than
yes,
Catholics?
Yes, this was when James II was the King of England,
Okay.
and he was a Catholic, and therefore they had the laws that way. And the second, they had laws that forbade hunting except by nobles and lords, which meant that ordinary folks couldn't have guns to go out hunting and catch game and so forth and so on. So those kind of laws were rather different from the kind of laws that we're talking about here. In addition, there was 150 years or more of history between them and the time that our Constitution was founded and the Bill of Rights written. And so we said they didn't have anything to do with it. Justice Stevens agreed and Justice Scalia disagreed. Then Justice Scalia looked at the term keep and bear arms and said that keep was the important thing, meaning that people could have them in their homes. We said, well, yes, you can keep them, but only if they're related to your duties as part of the militia, which was the question, the way we saw it. And then bear arms was a phrase which we pointed out had been used 25 or 30 times by the Congress that enacted laws right after the Second Amendment, all of which were in a military context. And the majority said, well, yes, it's true that many times it's used in a military context, but the phrase doesn't necessarily mean military, and therefore, given the history and other things, we think it was intended to apply this way.
Yeah. Well, you know, I want to talk about another issue, though, which is that in this country, individuals do have, under the law, the right to defend themselves and their families with whatever necessary force, whatever force is necessary under the circumstances, including deadly force. The laws of every state and every jurisdiction and the District of Columbia allow for the use of deadly force if absolutely necessary if a person's in imminent danger of serious bodily injury or death. So I think a lot of people, even people who believe in gun control laws, would say, well, you know, if I'm in my home and someone's coming in my home and they pose a threat to my life or the life of my family, I should have the right to have a weapon there to defend myself against someone who may have a gun.
Well, the district's position was not that you don't have a right to a weapon, in fact, a gun. The question is whether you have a right to a handgun.
Okay.
Because you remember, you're allowed to have rifles and shotguns. And in fact, we found this very interesting article in a magazine that I don't normally read called Guns and Ammo, in which there was debate between two gun enthusiasts about whether shotguns or rifles were better for self-defense at home rather than handguns. Both of them thought handguns were not good because they're hard to control, they're not accurate, they don't appear to be as threatening to intruders. And so the district said, look, you can have a weapon, you just can't have a handgun, which are uniquely dangerous, which are easy to steal, which are easy to conceal, and which cause many, many accidents and suicides. Suicides in particular. Most suicides with guns are with handguns, not with rifles. Committing suicide with a shotgun or a rifle is a very hard thing to do.
What about this trigger lock issue, though, in the D.C. law?
Well, the district law was to show you how concerned we were with safety in the home. The district had a provision, trigger lock law, that said either the gun had to be unloaded or it had to be had to have a trigger lock on it. And that trigger lock provision was not really discussed or litigated very much at all in the lower courts, because the lower courts went off on the grounds that there was no Second Amendment right at all, so you didn't have to worry about how the trigger lock operated or in what circumstances it applied. The opponent said that the trigger lock law actually forbade people even having rifles or shotguns from using them at all because there was no exception for self-defense.
Is that true?
Well, the answer is nobody had ever made that claim. Nobody had ever been prosecuted for it. Nobody had ever issued a rule saying that that's the way the law ought to be interpreted. The district took the position that there was an implied exception, that given the kind of self-defense rights that you talked about a moment ago, that everybody assumes that you would have a self-defense right, and no sensible person would assume that that meant the contrary. The court said, well, there is an exception for having guns in your workplace, the trigger lock provision. And they said, therefore, it wasn't at your home. And we said, no, it's not the question of whether your home possession, it's whether, if it's at your home, you have a self-defense right to use it.
I see.
In any event, the court read it strictly against the district and said that was another reason. That's a problem that surely would have been fixed and can be fixed by the district now. Trigger locks are very important because they prevent accidents at home, and especially with children. And I'm sure that the district is not going to lightly give up on the trigger locks, although they will make clear what it was always the case, that they didn't intend to forbid self-defense.
Now, you know, there are studies that show that a lot of countries that have the most handguns have higher homicide rates, but there are studies on both sides of this issue. I mean, you know, how do we know which study really gives us the proper data on that issue?
Well, I don't think there are any studies, if one is completely honest about this, that prove it either way. And we said for that reason, when the matter is in doubt, and when you're trying to predict which is going to be more harmful to the people, that we ought to trust our legislators, our elected representatives, to decide those questions.
Sure.
And we ought not to have, in the words of the right-wing critics of the courts, unelected judges deciding those questions.
We're almost out of time. I did want to ask you what you think, very briefly, will be the effect of this case in the future.
First, litigation. Second, more laws being debated. Third, almost certainly more deaths from homicides and accidents, and probably more deaths from violence and criminals.
I hope that's not the case.
I hope not too.
Thanks, Alan Morrison, for your insights on this very important case that will certainly have a major impact on the future of gun control laws in this country. I'm Angela Jordan Davis, and this has been Courting Justice.
Grandma, get your gun. The wolves are in the yard. They have come for the children. You ain't really got to shoot at nobody. Just aim for the moon, graze Alpha Centauri's shoulder, let stardust rain down, knock the devil on his, you know. Make sure he don't come around here so quick, so slick, next time, no more. Grandma, get your gun. The wolves are in the yard. It's feeding time. Don't you know that destiny is a delicacy? Promise is quite tasty, and legacy will stick sweet to your ribs like family reunion barbecue. Revolution may be a bit lumpy, but it goes down smooth like your mashed potatoes. Grandma, get your gun. It used to be safe out here in the country. Young kings and queens could skip through the fields sniffing daffodils. But now, all the daffodils have been replaced by snapdragons, breathing down their necks the fires of this hellish existence, burning away all memories of how to be royalty. At every corner, a new definition of Venus, fly-trapping the children's souls, swallowing their consciousness whole, teaching them that the natural state of their spirit is not beautiful. New age roosters have turned our babies into forgetful farm fowl. Now the coops are filled to overflow with eagles, thinking that the life of a chicken is acceptable, thinking that flying is overrated. The foxes have become bold and the weasels fearless. They will come in, up, over, and around your yard in broad daylight to snatch the eggs. Someone even taught the jackal how to play the drum. Now he's tap, 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 tapping to the beat. The jackal has mastered the boom bap. And watch the babies form a Congo line behind him, shaking their groove thing. He will dance them right out of the village. Grandma, the piper's price is too high. Can't we just shoot him? I know we hid the guns to shield the babies from the violence, but now the sisters are being pimped by fashion and prostituted by billboard. I know we hid the guns to shield the babies from misogyny, misandry, misanthropy, but now the brothers don't know how to defend themselves, swapping chains for puppet strings. Watch them knock each other out. Grandma, get your gun. Get the buckshot, get the hollow point bullets. Grandma, get the camouflage. It is time to stop playing, because life was never a game. Our freedom never will be, and our survival never is. Grandma, get your gun. The wolves are in the yard. Grandma, get your gun. The wolves are in the yard. Grandma, get your gun and give it to me.
Welcome to WorkLife at the Coffee House. Much has been said about the important impact the upcoming presidential and congressional elections will have on a wide range of issues. But perhaps a little less is known about how the election might affect labor issues. What is at stake in this election for unions and workers? What issues will unions be pressing a new president and Congress to address? How will the outcome of the election affect these issues? And who are the unions supporting? To address these questions, I am pleased to have as my guest today Bill Samuel, the Legislative Director of the AFL-CIO. Bill, thank you for joining us today on the Coffee House.
Thanks for having me.
So what are some of the issues that the AFL-CIO feels are most important and are at play in this election?
Well, the economy is by far the most important issue for every American and of course most union members. Workers have been under assault, their unions have been under assault for more than a decade now, but by and large the biggest issue facing workers is how they're going to continue to make ends meet against the rising gas prices, prices for college education, health care, at the same time that wages are stagnating or falling across the economy.
So what are some of the legislative issues, what are some of the bills that are out there that you think might have the most direct effect on those kinds of issues?
Well, we've been pressing Congress for some time now to pass an economic stimulus package. They passed one in January, which we thought was a fairly modest effort. It included rebate checks, which many Americans are getting now. Unfortunately, because of the state of the economy, most people are using those checks to pay off a credit card bill or a home mortgage. Much more needs to be done. Congress really needs to take very bold action. It may not happen in this session of Congress, and that's why we're looking forward to the next election.
What about some of the legislative issues and other issues that more directly affect unions and the ability of unions to play a role on these critical questions?
Right. Well, workers' rights is a big issue. Workers, as I said, have been under attack, particularly those who want to engage in collective bargaining. Over the past couple of decades, it's become increasingly difficult to form unions and to bargain. Employers have become very skilled at both using loopholes in the law and in many cases violating the law, which is supposed to protect the rights of workers to form unions and bargain collectively. So we will be pushing legislation to correct some of those imbalances and make it possible for workers once again to have a voice on the job, to organize if they want to into a union, and to bargain collectively.
So where do the candidates stand on these? The presidential candidates, and there's also, of course, a third of the Senate and the entire House of Representatives. Where's the range of views and the different candidates for office on some of these issues?
Well, we're fortunate we have two candidates who diverge very starkly in terms of their record on worker issues. John McCain has been running for president. John McCain has been in the Senate for more than a couple of decades now, and his voting record is pretty close to zero in terms of supporting workers' rights. And a whole host of issues from the right to organize, even issues as basic as the minimum wage and enforcing overtime laws. John McCain has stood with corporate interests and against workers and their unions. Senator Obama has been in the Congress a much shorter time, but in fact has voted with working families and their issues pretty consistently. He's taken positions on most of those issues favorable to working families and their unions, and he has a record actually prior to being an office holder as a community organizer.
So it sounds certainly like you're endorsing, supporting Senator Obama. Tell us about where that stands now. I know unions in the primary process endorse different candidates. Right. Where does the AFL stand now in terms of the presidential race?
Right. Well, about 10 days ago, the AFL-CIO voted to endorse Barack Obama for president. We had held back through the primary process, primary season, because our unions were divided. We had a number of unions who wanted to endorse Hillary Clinton, had a strong record of support for working families. Many unions endorsed John Edwards, and some unions endorsed Barack Obama. So out of respect for our individual unions that make up the AFL-CIO, we decided not to try to force the issue, waited till the primary process was done. All the unions then gathered together about 10 days ago in Washington, D.C., heard from Barack Obama. He came to meet with the presidents of the unions, and the endorsement was made at that time.
So, okay, we've talked about a number of legislative issues. Obviously, a new president, a new administration has a wide impact on a range of policy issues that aren't legislative. What are some of those kinds of issues, and where does the candidate stand on some of those questions?
Right. Well, the executive branch has enormous power, obviously, in determining whether the laws are enforced and whether they're interpreted in a way that favors workers over employers when there's a conflict. The National Labor Relations Board evaluates conflicts between workers and employers. The Labor Department enforces overtime laws, occupational safety and health laws, pension rights, and other concerns of working families. So who's in charge of those agencies has a tremendous bearing on how those laws are enforced and how they're interpreted. So a new president will replace the current executive branch from top to bottom, and that'll make a big difference in how those laws are.
But aren't those agencies essentially run by public servants, by people in the civil service? So how does a new president coming in way at the top, does it really have any impact on those kinds of things?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, you would like to think that these laws are enforced the same whether it's a Democrat or Republican in the White House. The problem is the executive branch at the very top is controlled by political appointees. Budgets are determined by those appointees. Decisions about whether or not to pursue cases, again, how to enforce and interpret regulations, how to enforce acts of Congress that may occur during that presidential term, are all made by political leaders in those various agencies. We used to make the joke that we now have two departments of commerce instead of a Department of Labor and a Department of Commerce, because the current labor secretary rarely sides with working families or unions.
You say the current labor secretary. I mean, what are some of your concerns? I mean, we don't really hear too much about that. I mean, you know, the law is the law. The law is being enforced.
Well, right now the labor secretary is trying to change the Family Medical Leave Act by regulation to restrict the use of family medical leave, to make it more difficult for workers to take the 12 weeks that are guaranteed under the law by changing regulations. About 3 years ago, the labor secretary pushed through a regulatory change, changing the number of workers covered by our overtime laws, depriving about 6 million workers of the protection of the 40-hour week and time and a half for overtime, again, through regulation, not through legislation.
But I mean, the legislation sets the law. How can regulators do that?
Well, the laws have to be interpreted by federal agencies. Some are drafted very tightly, not giving much discretion to regulators. Some, over time, change, and meeting changing circumstances, new executive branch officials can interpret them differently and issue regulations that change the way they're enforced.
All right, so now the primary season is over. The AFL-CIO has endorsed presidential candidate. I assume you're endorsing in a number of the senatorial and congressional races as well. What does it mean? So what? Now that you've endorsed, what happens now?
Well, we go to work trying to communicate and educate our members and their families. There are about 13 million union members. Multiply that by the number of household members in those families. We can communicate with all of them, and we do. That's mostly where our resources are spent. We learned a long time ago we can't tell our union members who to vote for, and we can't simply say the union has endorsed candidate X, vote for candidate X. We have to educate them and inform them. So between now and November, we'll probably contact most union members 20 or 25 times at work, at home, at church, at civic clubs, and we'll talk about the issues that are important, and we'll try to distinguish the positions of Senator Obama from Senator McCain. We hope that will lead them to vote for Senator Barack Obama.
So how does that sound? What does that look like? I mean, you contact them about the issues. Right. I mean, what are the issues that you will be talking about specifically? You mentioned a few before, but you know, when those conversations happen, what do they sound like?
Well, we hope they happen at work, where you trust the messenger. So someone you work with picks up a flyer at the gate. It talks about Senator McCain's position on health care reform, and it contrasts that with Senator Obama's. We think Senator Obama's is better for ordinary Americans to hold on to their health insurance and to be able to afford health insurance for their family. We think Senator McCain's health care program puts most Americans out on their own. So the flyer will describe the two positions, and we hope that'll start a conversation at work. We may follow that up with a phone call or a house visit by a volunteer, again, a worker in the neighborhood, with another flyer, maybe a petition. It's basically starting a conversation and keeping it going through November about the issues that are important to working families.
We heard a lot, especially during the primary season, about the blue-collar voter, especially in some of the battleground states. I mean, this was a real point of contention during the Democratic primary. A lot of union members are blue-collar workers in these states, and both candidates are apparently consider this an important vote. How do you intend to speak to this question? How do you intend to talk to voters with those in those places with those concerns?
Right. Well, you're right. In these key battleground states, working families and union members are a very large share of the voting population. Ohio, about 30% in the last election came from union households. The same in Pennsylvania, Illinois. So in the battleground states, Wisconsin, Minnesota, those Midwest industrial states particularly, blue-collar voters make up a third or more, particularly union members in blue-collar households make up a third or more of the voting age population and those who turn out. And we have a pretty good record of informing union members and union household members of the various positions that candidates take, and at the end of the day, about 70% of them vote for the candidate that we've endorsed.
And is there any indication that that's different than they might have voted otherwise?
Well, I think if you compare union members against non-union members of the same gender, race, education background, income, you'll find that the union member who's been contacted at work tends to vote much more along the lines that the union has recommended than the person who's not a member of a union and hasn't received those communications. So gun owners, for example, if you're a union member, gun owner, a union member who's a regular churchgoer, you're more likely to have voted for John Kerry than if you're a gun owner or a church-going a member who's not a union member.
At this point in the campaign, I assume these conversations have begun. Yeah. And what's some of the feedback you're getting? What's the feeling out there? What's your sense of how this campaign is unfolding at this point?
Well, people are very focused on the economy and they're looking for solutions. We spent most of the spring trying to define John McCain for our members. We hadn't endorsed a candidate, so we were simply defining John McCain as we see him based on his record in the Senate. John McCain started out with pretty high favorable ratings among union families and union members. They felt that he was independent, kind of a maverick. They liked the fact that he's a war hero. But with enough communication about the issues, his favorability ratings among our members dropped about 20 points between February and May. Now we're just beginning to introduce Barack Obama to our members, and we think that'll put him in pretty good stead with union families.
And again, what's your sense of what those issues are? We just have a few seconds left. That are?
Well, again, I think it's how are families going to keep up with rising prices. Wages have stagnated for 20 years. We're now either in a recession or entering a recession. The problem is the last recession ended about 5 years ago, and working families never recovered from that one. They're about to get into a deeper hole now. People are worried about their futures, they're worried about their families, and we've got to give them some confidence that Barack Obama has the answer to those problems.
Well, it is clear that important labor concerns have been building for many years. What happens in the November elections will determine how these issues are resolved. As we've heard today, unions believe the stakes are high and are mobilizing to assert their views and mobilize their members as never before. The effectiveness of these efforts will play an important role in determining the outcome of the election. I'm Fred Feinstein, and this has been WorkLife.
I'm on to Hollywood City where the girls are pretty like a rose hanging on the vine. When I get to that city where the girls are pretty, I'm gonna make one, I'm gonna put her in a home overlooking the sights. I'm gonna build a big pool like a Hollywood fool, party all night. I'm gonna buy me a car and a long cigar. I'm gonna throw the top back, put a poodle in the lap of my Hollywood star. Well, I'm gone to Hollywood City, I'm gone. I'm on to Hollywood City where the girls are pretty like a palm swaying in the breeze. When I get to that city where the girls are pretty, well, I'll live a life of ease. I'm gonna buy me some clothes that'll really be loud. I'm gonna take a little trip down the Sunset Strip like a Hollywood crowd. I'm gonna get me some shades, turn everything blue. I'm gonna spend a little time down at Hollywood and Vine like the movie stars do. I'm gone to Hollywood City, I'm gone. I'm on to Hollywood City where the girls are pretty like a rose hanging on the vine. When I get to that city where the girls are pretty, well, I'm gonna make one mine.
Well, Bill, I'd like to welcome you to the musical traditions segment of
Thank
Takoma
you.
Coffee House.
Thank you very much.
That was a song I haven't heard before. How come?
Well, you didn't buy your cheapy record of Carl Perkins on the Harmony label back then. It was a song that, I forget who wrote it, a real famous writer. I'm blanking out now. The guy wrote a lot of Jerry Lee Lewis songs, but Carl Perkins did around the same time. He did Restless and Pointed Toed Shoes
Okay,
on
now
the Columbia label.
You're sort of twisting it around a little bit. You're your own genre now.
That's right.
And what are we calling this? Diesel Billy.
Diesel Billy, that's right.
And it's something to do with the Cracker Barrel stores?
Well, we got a new CD out on the Cracker Barrel label. That's right. That's right. The same Cracker Barrel.
The same Cracker Barrel.
Right. From the restaurant chain, not the cheese people, but the restaurant chain.
Okay.
And Joe Wilson and all the people at National Council for Traditional Arts have put together a series of Americana, 15 CDs.
Do people stopping at Cracker Barrel, they don't know what's going to hit them, right?
Well,
I mean,
they got an Asleep at the Wheel record, a Seldom Seen. Dudley Cannell's got one with a gospel group, Linda Lay, Balfour Brothers.
Yeah, this
Cephas
isn't
and
the
Wiggins.
usual schlock that you get in the
Right.
$9.99
That's right.
markdown.
We're trying to, give them chicken fried quality
I love it.
with country gravy.
Now you got you were nominated recently for a Grammy Award.
That's right, I was.
Not a Granny Award, but a Grammy.
Grammy,
A
that's
Grammy Award.
Who knew?
Yes. And you're a loser, as I recall.
I lost.
All
I
right,
lost
that's
him.
good. There's a lot of famous losers.
I had the distinction of losing to Flat and Scruggs, so
That's good.
Not that I couldn't have lost to anybody, but it so
Yeah.
happened I lost to
Quality.
a titan, a giant
Yeah.
in the field.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, you were
I
just.
went out with my head held high.
That's cool. You want to?
I wasn't crushed. Should
no.
I do that song?
Yeah, you could do that song. Yeah,
Should I use this Telecaster?
it's there. Might as
I'll
well.
try it.
Okay, take it away.
All right. Luckily, somebody left a perfectly good Telecaster guitar on stage, so. This was our Grammy-nominated song called Poultry in Motion. Poultry, that's poultry. Poultry.
tinsel wings snipped out of horsehair, head concealed in its helmet, emerald thorax, the compound eye exquisite in its glass beer, all luminous nymphs or naiads, hatched not from larva but a thin filament drop at the stream. They are beautiful, I say, not knowing the real from the fake, from bug-like nymph stage to dun, rainbow to spinners, all names that ring like a bell, brown drake, blue-winged olive, yellow miller, black ghost, coachman and mayflies, eggs reborn, bursting, dodging like microscopic miniatures of man's first flying machines, pinions flapping on arm, sailing up over treetops, foredoomed as winter's only lightning bug, flecks of snow hitting the pond surface, then ebbing one by one. What counterfeit jewels, a little tarnished from the wear and tear, now housed in a tin box like sampled candies, feigning sleep as frozen statues do, rested in the sham stillness of the summer heat, just catching the rust of sunlight on the brittle hinges of their spidery legs and paintbrush tails. I think of them all as sudden masterpieces, and then seem to nudge them irresistibly, as if to shock them from the airy airlessness of some human dream, as if they were not so frail or waterlogged, that from all this molting, colliding, and diving, only to rise again each time from the dead.
Welcome to In Step at the Coffee House. I'd like you to think of the world as one village. Then think of that one world village having one glorious multi-dimensional language in dance. Somewhere near the center of that dance would be our guest, Christopher Morgan. A versatile performer, an awarded choreographer, and a teacher and facilitator with a depth beyond his years, Christopher currently directs his own New York-based company, Muse, while also serving as artistic associate and rehearsal director for Washington, D.C. area's City Dance Ensemble, and as the artistic director of the Oh My Dance residency program in upstate New York. Welcome to the Coffee House, Chris, and I'm glad we have you in one place long enough to chat.
Thank you, Peter. It's great to be here.
We've known each other a long time, and sometimes I have to erase what I know because I think it allows a person to ask more naive questions and get more full answers. So you do so much, in the dance world. Do you find that this is a normal thing for you, that you're always doing so much, or how did you get to wear so many hats?
I actually think it's something that a lot of people throughout the dance world have to do in order to make a living through their art form. Like most arts, it's not very well funded, so a lot of us juggle many different aspects of work, both within and without dance. Right. And I've been very fortunate that all of my work has been able to be in the field of dance, which has been a real blessing. And as you noted, I do lots of different things. And I think also that has always been a passion of mine, to be involved in as many aspects of what I do as possible. So right. I think it's sort of inherent to my personality.
Sure. And in the old days, we would all wait tables and then or cater waiter and do that, and then try to heal all those wounds and then get on the dance floor and dance. Do you find that having the heads all in one place, part choreographer, part dancer yourself, still part administrator, do the lines get blurred for you sometimes? Does it get too confusing, or do you relish that, or?
That's an interesting question, because I think in my heart of hearts I'm an artist always, right. And a lot of the other hats I wear in order to help facilitate the creation of what is my right. most strong passion, the making right. of the art. And it's really easy to lose sense of that core value a lot of times when you are juggling so many different balls sure. and trying to facilitate other people and be an administrator and direct the work.
Sure, yeah. So. And one of the hats you wear right now is head of Oh My, which is a more recent thing, the last couple of years you've done, right?
Exactly. This summer will be my third summer directing the residency program for dancers.
And so you're helping other artists do what it is that you do.
Yes.
And how is that?
It's really incredible. It's a program that invites 10 different dancer choreographers, and we look for people that have an interest in both, that are still performing and actively making work.
Right.
The organization in all of its different programs is committed to having the artists be at least 60% from abroad. So on average, we have 10 residents from as many as 7 different countries come together. And as much as possible, we try and get very diverse groups of people, both geographically, as well as their styles of dance,
Right.
and see what happens if they're isolated in a really beautiful setting for 3 weeks without having to worry about their normal needs of food and housing. What happens if these very different people come together to make
Right.
art? So it's actually been really great both to witness and facilitate their art making, but it's also really enriched my own to see all these
Sure.
differences.
It's almost like you've created a situation that you would have liked to had as a, well, even like now as a maturing choreographer. I would say, what do they say, emerging, and then what happens to us after they,
Mid-career.
whatever that. Well, and you do make your own work, and from your background, when you mention the international flavor of Oh My, I think that you are almost a representative of that yourself. I mean, you come from a very varied background yourself, from contemporary dance and ballet and Hawaiian hula and other things that you haven't told me about. But how do you make a language of dance for yourself that makes sense to you, and how do you translate that out to your audiences? Is that a fair question to ask?
You know, it's most of my work that I make as a choreographer starts with an initial thought about the content of the work, and that everything that comes into play, the movement vocabularies that I draw on, scenic design, costume design, I'm starting to play with video a little bit now as well,
Right.
lighting, all of that sort of serve the initial idea. So I'm very much a content-driven artist, and more as my work develops, I realize that though I'm very passionate about dance, that's just the medium for whatever the thought is. And if other
Right.
things come into play, different types of movement, or even different genres of art, that's okay, because I'm trying to serve this purpose of the initial idea.
Sure, sure. And do you find that now in this day and age we have, you mentioned film a little bit, and we talked before about self-commissioning. You know, each new work, do you give yourself a new assignment? And for instance, you made a recent work, and as I did too, for the Washington Shakespeare Festival, dance works from. They're very different, but inspired by sonnets. So,
Yeah.
so you commissioned yourself within that commission?
Yeah, we with City Dance Ensemble, we had a project where we partnered with the Shakespeare Theater Company here in Washington, D.C., and the commission was to make a work on Shakespeare sonnets, which is a rather daunting subject matter.
Right.
And so as I was investigating and researching the sonnets, I decided to look at these 3 main characters that appear throughout the body of the sonnets, and a love triangle that's inherent in them. And a lot of scholars researched this over time.
Right.
And what interested me most was realizing that a lot of this research was not part of my education of the sonnets as a young man. And in studying the sonnets as a grown adult and learning that there actually was a love triangle between the writer and the fair youth, which was another man, and this woman, the dark lady, I realized that I'd sort of been in the dark all the time about what might actually be the true nature of the sonnets.
Right.
So I was really interested in that and decided to title the piece So Foul a Lie, and looked at these 3 characters, but also I was just really interested in the idea of lie and deception, and how the culture of a certain time can dictate how everything's interpreted around it. So whether or not the writer intended these to be homoerotic nature or not is debatable, but that it was so masked from scholarly study for so long, I thought was really the most interesting thing about it.
Yeah, that's great. And so within that, the mini commission, stage work and going into text and movement and the whole music, the whole thing. And then a more recent assignment you talked about before was going into film and dance. And I think a lot of people who might be watching may not understand the differences, the nuances between conducting dances for stage and conducting dances for film. What can you tell us about that?
It's such a different challenge, you know. Dancing in a large theater with multiple balconies and a far distance audience. The the way you use your physical instrument, your body, can be very different than if a camera zooms in and frames you tightly and gets the intricacy of just a hand gesture or just your face. So to sort of actually contradict myself, I decided to make something that was not content-driven at all, and I gave myself a physical task of working on film and sort of researching physically, just in a very simple way, all of these different tasks, and using a camera myself, and how does that frame a perspective differently than in a large theater.
Yeah, and what's happened? You've started this now? And
yeah, I started this little project. It's called One Take Wonder, and the idea is that I actually had to do everything myself, from playing the sound, from filming to dancing in it to moving the camera. So you have to. That's great. You have to do everything.
Yeah. I often, when I think of artists. In my spare time, I make my little list of artists that I might title Artists of the 21st Century, and your name always appears on that list when I make the people that I'd like to work with or continue to work with. And so it makes me want to ask you, what do you think are the skills that we need as artists coming up? I mean, is it the idea that we are self-commissioning regardless of the commissions that we have out there? I don't know. I mean, you're young, you're talented, and you've got a lot of smarts. What's in the future for dance?
I think for me, the thing that always excites me is, in myself or in other artists, is not being afraid to ask questions, not being afraid to ask yourself questions, or also ask your audience questions, and to really push and challenge. And I think the older I get, the more I feel like I often fight the fear that I have to ask those questions and to push. But then I think the more that happens, the more the art can flourish, and the more that art can actually find its true role in our world and be the reflection of a society that I believe it is intended to be and should be.
And audiences, I mean, sometimes it's a black void out there. We never get to really talk to them, and I wonder how you find out from them, what they want, what they need, how they, and even regardless of what an audience wants or thinks they want, how do you get deeper in that conversation when they're out there and you're on stage? Or
oh, that's such a catch-22. Sometimes I'm one of those artists who really likes to ignore that and just listen to my own voice and try and find what it is that I'm trying to do and be true to that. And then other times, I do hear the feedback, and that sonnets piece that I was just talking about a moment ago, I actually had a lot of people walk out of the performances of that, and part of me thinks that's a wonderful response, because in some way it did challenge them, and it did ask those people questions. And the comments that the staff found out was that they were sort of bothered by the sexual content of the work. And though I don't want to offend anyone's ideals or morals, it does sort of make me wonder, well, why would these questions be offensive? And maybe in a way that actually is a good thing, that it left someone with some strong questions that made them sit up and take notice.
Sure. So even, it's great to hear that even within the non-dialogue, there's dialogue and questions being asked as well. So that's great. That's wonderful. So before you zip out to another corner of this wide world to create a dance or create the opportunity for others to do so, we'll say thank you to you, Chris, and to those of you watching for visiting us here at the Coffee House. Till next time, I'm Peter DeMuro, and this has been In Step.